deposed Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad is now in Russia. And according to some reports, he fled with just a couple of bucks in his pockets. Just how did Assad make sure he looted the Syrian treasury on his way out? Plus, is he not alone in being a country's head that took the cash and left his country in the dust? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about old Assad making off with the cash. Okay, so this is according to a report actually from the Financial Times, who was able to review the actual financial statements from Russian banks, reporting that Assad made off with $250 million in cash from Syria to Russia over the span of just 2 years. Now, what's even more interesting is that Assad, again, airlifted about $250 million in cash to Moscow. This is between the years of 2018 and 2019, according to FT. And this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that this is just a 2-year window that we're talking about here. And so remember, the Syrian civil war started around 2014. So what you're looking at is a way, way longer window in which Assad was likely looting his country's treasury in order to preserve him and his family's wealth, right? Now, obviously, once 2018, 2019 is when Moscow really intervened to sort of prop up Assad. And so he likely wanted to put his cash in Moscow as a kind of insurance policy. It may also have been a kind of two-way insurance policy, right? Moscow wanted to be sure that Assad was going to remain their guy. And by keeping his money in their banks, or rather the Syrian government's money that Assad had stolen, in Russian banks, it meant that Assad would always have to kind of be beholden to Moscow, right? Now, this was literally done the hard way. Literally, Syria's central bank showed statements that nearly 2 tons of $100 bills and 500 euro notes flew into Russia, which were then deposited in now sanctioned Russian banks, right? Now, at the time, Syria was in massive debt to Russia for its military support, of course, and Assad's relatives were also buying up assets in Russia, including luxury apartments. So again, this is a sign that in 2018, the Assads realized they had finally made a powerful friend who would really have their backing through and through, right? Now, again, Moscow put some troops in Syria in 2015, and that's likely when this wealth transfer began. But the incredible part is, again, that this was something that was looted from the Syrian foreign reserves, right? $100 bills and 500 euro notes are generally kept by sovereign nations in these large quantities as foreign currency reserves, and they're used to stabilize the home currency. For example, let's say the value of the Syrian, I think it's dinar, starts to fall, and the Syrian government says, listen, we need to make sure that someone still demands this currency. Otherwise, it's going to fall. It's going to drive food prices even higher. And so central banks will actually trade with other countries, other banks. They'll trade their home currency. They'll buy it, and they'll give them euros or dollars or other sought-after internationally stable currencies. These are called foreign reserves. And so the fact that Assad was looting these foreign reserves is a sign that, again, he probably knew at least as early as 2018 that his regime was probably never going to fully stabilize. Right. One expert told the FT that the transfers of cash from Damascus to Moscow were evidence of, quote, a combination of securing their ill-gotten gains and Syria's patrimony abroad. So that's sort of what we're talking about. That's the two-way street we're talking about. Assad wants to put his money somewhere safe. Because remember, if Assad were to the West was pretty anti-Assad. They actually bankrolled some of the opposition groups and sanctioned him when he was found to be using chemical weapons on his own people. And so Assad probably didn't want to put his money too directly into Western banks. Now, he almost certainly has some, right? And maybe not banks, maybe apartments owned through shell companies, that sort of thing. But he wanted to make sure that large portions of his wealth were in countries that were not going to hold him accountable, or that they were not going to seize that wealth. And that's probably why in 2018 he put it in Moscow, because he felt that Moscow, again, would be a secure place to hold his money. And in turn, Assad would be beholden to Putin and the Kremlin, right? According to a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, he said, quote, the regime would have to bring their money abroad to a safe haven to be able to use it to procure the fine life for the regime and its inner circle. And this is one of the things that we often forget about these kind of dictatorship regimes, is that they rule with an iron fist over regular people, but for those that consolidate enough power, they have to offer a carrot and a stick. And usually the stick is very apparent with someone like Assad. Death or jail, confiscation of your resources. But remember, as we saw with people like Prigozhin, at some point you can control so many resources that the government itself may say, I think we need to make a deal with this guy. And that's where the carrot comes in, right? That's where someone like Assad will say, listen, if you play ball with the regime, help out the regime's people, you pay your taxes and a little bit extra on the side to your boy Assad, we are going to make sure that you guys stay secure, you get access to the good life, you and your family get preferential treatment, you get access to state resources to use as you see fit. Again, this is why you see so many oligarchs in Russia who hold official government positions that are kind of do nothing, right? They'll be like minister of sport, but it confers some state resources onto them that they can then spend as they choose. And especially things like minister of sport or, supervising like industries that are just comically easy to supervise. Again, a minister of mines, right? You're like, okay, it's a mine, dude. You pull the dirt out, you turn it into the good stuff, and you ship it off, right? And so those kind of folks really want access to those state coffers, and they get them in exchange, of course, for their loyalty and their willingness to do Putin's dirty work. Anyway, what I want to point out is, as a proportion of the Syrian government budget as of about 2023, right, that is, they have a budget of about $6 billion. So for context, again, you're talking about, let's assume that over those 2 years, he continued to average about $125 million out. So we're going to do $6 billion. There we go. Divided by the $120 million a year Assad's pulling out. That means that about one in every $50,000 spent by the Syrian government ended up in Assad's, not just ended up in Assad's accounts, but ended up just in his accounts in Russian banks. For context, in the United States, that would be the equivalent of, let's see, I think that's about it here. 210,000 billion. Nope, we just got one more. There you go. So if that were the U.S. budget size, actually, I think I'm one high. I think we actually have about a $2 trillion budget. And then, right, you divide that by 50,000. That's the equivalent of the president looting about $42 million from the treasury. So again, kind of a drop in the bucket, so to speak, to you and I, but certainly not to someone like that. But here's the funny thing. He's not alone in having run this scheme. This is actually a tried and true method. But before we talk about who else has been known to make off with state money, I wanted to mention, of course, that if it's the holidays and if you need that little extra boost to make it through Christmas, I get it. You want to check out some StrikeGum, right? 90 milligrams caffeine in every piece. That's as much as a Red Bull or an Amp Energy. 0 sugar. We're the highest rated energy gum on Amazon for a reason. And if you need something to fuel your holidays and into the new year, you want to get your StrikeGum. Check it out at strikegum.com or on Amazon. Okay. The other person who ran this playbook is Ashraf Ghani, former Afghan president. Now, here's where things get kind of funny, right? And the Ashraf Ghani was a former Afghan president backed by the United States, almost comically corrupt, right? Like ghoulishly comically corrupt. And when he and his aides fled Afghanistan on a fleet of 4 helicopters, this was in 2022, the Russian embassy alleged that they took millions in U.S. cash with them. This, of course, was money provided by the U.S. government to the Afghan government to sustain its operations. But now the cigar points out, he says, well, if he really did flee with the allegation was about $200 million, it would have been physically impossible, right? That $169 million onto Ghani's custom Soviet-built helicopters would have been just physically unable to do so. Even if it was in the high-denomination $100 bills, it would have weighed 2 tons, been 7.5 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. The helicopters had absolutely no way to store that much money in there, so there's absolutely no way. And this is a classic SIGAR report because oftentimes IGs get very narrow scopes, and they focus on those scopes very deeply. So SIGAR was probably asked, did Ashraf Ghani flee with $169 million in a helicopter? They're like, no, it would have been impossible for both him and his entourage and the money to fit in one of these helicopters. It's very hard to move that much money. But that doesn't mean that nothing happened, right? There's a huge problem, and that is the Afghan National Directorate of Security. This is Afghanistan's CIA. And in fact, there's rumors that its $225 million budget, tens of millions of which was straight cash, was actually provided by the CIA, right? The money was supposed to bribe local warlords, anti-Taliban militias, and just other folks who needed cold, hard, uncounted for cash to keep the Taliban at bay. One senior Afghan official told U.S. investigators that the NDS had about $70 million in cash reserves. Now, obviously, those cash reserves were likely held onto because they were supposed to go to these warlords, but instead the greedy Afghan government likely stiffed those warlords and kept the cash for themselves. And then, mysteriously, when the Taliban rolled into Kabul, all that cash was gone. It was less than $1 million when the Taliban arrived, literally the day after Ghani and his aides left. So this cash reserve from the NDS just vanished mysteriously. Now, is it clear that it was Ghani that took it? No, that's what they say. They say somebody made off with $70 million, or some group of people divided $70 million among themselves. And in all likelihood, right, it likely was multiple senior Afghan officials who made off with it, various members of the NDS, anybody who had access to it likely took that cash, bribed their way out of Afghanistan, and ended up with Ghani in Dubai. So this is a tried and true method. And like Assad, in all likelihood, Ghani and others had been moving their wealth out of the country for a long time. If you're in a country in conflict, it's pretty common for you to find ways to hedge your bets and hide your wealth elsewhere. It's one of the reasons why people thought Zelensky was so exceptional, in that he not only did he not appear to siphon his wealth off into foreign countries, or certainly not loot his government, he actually stayed and assumed tremendous personal risk. It's one of the reasons why, the Ukraine war has a bunch of differences from these other wars, but in a huge one is the actual commitment by the leadership to actually lead their country. Anyway, that's all I had. The only last note I wanted to make, first off, if you haven't hit the subscribe button, please do so. It makes a difference. But also, one little funny piece of fake news. He said that Assad, who actually had been an ophthalmologist before his older brother was killed, and he had to come assume the mantle of Syria, rumor is he's going to return to an ophthalmology clinic now that he's been ousted as president of Syria. This is, of course, completely fake. Anyway, guys, thanks a lot. Thanks to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.